Greetings, everyone, and welcome once again to our Bhagavad-gita Satsang. It is an honor to have you here with me and a great pleasure for me to be here with you. I would like to especially welcome those of you who are new to the Satsang. Many of you have joined us recently, and I'm very, very happy to have you here. So a warm welcome to you in particular. And Annie, welcome. I see you've already taken the raise hand for a test drive, and I would like everyone else to take that same function for a test drive just to let me know that you can hear me. And you can. So there is my validation for the start of our program. Thank you very, very much for letting me know. And let's get on to our other housekeeping tasks. So especially for those of you who are new to our live satsang, you can adjust your audio settings and your viewing options up in the upper right-hand corner. I suspect that's where you'll find your tools. You need not worry about your microphone or video camera, because while you can see and hear me, I cannot see or hear you. But if you would like to make yourself heard, and I certainly hope that that will be the case, you can always use the chat box or the Q&A box to ask a question or make a comment or share a realization. Please do that at any time. I'll be keeping my eye on those boxes. And if I don't respond right away, it just means I'm trying to complete a thought. But I see you and I will respond to you. And that takes care of that. Last class, we are in chapter 14, the yoga of seeing the qualities of material nature. And we spoke about what the qualities of material nature will give you, what you get from acting under the influence of different qualities of material nature. Those qualities being tamagun, the quality of ignorance, rajagun, the quality of passion, and sattvaguna, or the quality of goodness, the three essential building blocks from which the material world is ultimately made. So the ultimate constituent, subtle, metaphysical elements of the material world. Also, where do you go? That is to say, where will these different material qualities take you? We covered verses 16 through 20. This evening, we are going to finish up this chapter on seeing the qualities of material nature with a description of how to recognize one who is beyond the influence of the gunas, or modes or qualities of material nature, and how to become someone who is beyond the modes of material nature. And we'll finish the chapter with Krishna's statement about how he himself is the foundation of Brahman, that is to say, the spiritual substratum of all of existence, dharma, righteousness, the true nature of things, and sukha, joy, sweetness. And we will cover verses 21 through 27. So before we begin, it is customary for us to chant an invocation mantra. So a teacher of yoga wisdom will customarily lead a chant, paying respects to his or her particular Ishta Devata, that is to say, the form of the absolute truth that the teacher has a particular relationship with and feels inspired by. So this is an opportunity also for me to introduce you to chanting transliterated Sanskrit. Sanskrit that is written in the Roman alphabet, but with diacritics to indicate, these are little marks that indicate how something is to be pronounced. So the dot over the M indicates we close our lips in front, the same way we would normally do with an M sound, but at the same time, we close the back of our tongue up to the back of the roof of our mouths. The bar across the top of a vowel, in this case an A, indicates an open and elongated version of that vowel as opposed to the vowel without the bar, which would make it a more contained and truncated version of that same vowel. And that tells you what you need to know about this. So I will chant this mantra, and if you like, you can chant it back. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. The translation: Om, indicating the absolute reality, I offer my respects, Namo, like Namaste, to the Supreme Person, Bhagavate, the son of Vasudev, Vasudev, who is the all-pervading transcendence. So in this mantra, the word Vasudev has a double meaning, indicating the son of Vasudev with a short a, and also the all-pervading transcendence. So this is a Vishnu mantra, specifically when translated as meaning indicating the son of Vasudev, indicating Krishna, who in the Puranas is the son of Vasudev and the speaker of Bhagavad-gita, hence the appropriateness of this particular mantra. So picking up from where we left off last week, verse 20, when the embodied soul transcends these three modes, meaning the qualities of material nature, which are associated with the material body, they become free from birth, death, old age, and suffering, for they have attained the nectar of immortality. So this evening, we're going to take a closer look at how these three modes of material nature are associated with the material body that we have, both the physical and metaphysical body that we have according to yoga philosophy, and speak a little bit more about rising above these different problems, birth, death, old age, and disease or suffering, that we experience simply by virtue of having one of these material bodies. So we will cover verses 21 through 27, and I will read the translation of each of these verses, and then we'll go back and look at them in greater detail. And if you have your edition of the Bhagavad-gita handy, or if you have more than one, please feel free to follow along. Your translation will probably be different from mine. And comparing translations is something that we like to do because that may give rise to questions or issues of comparison of different interpretations. So now Arjuna has a question, and we begin with Arjuna's three-part question. So this is verse 21. Arjuna said, "My dear Lord, what are the characteristics that define one who is transcendental to these three modes? How do they conduct themselves? How does one transcend these three modes of nature?" I'm going to read verses 20 through 25 as one cluster. So this is the translation of 22, 23, 24, and 25, 4 verses together. This begins Krishna's reply. The Blessed Lord said, "O son of Pandu, one who does not hate illumination, attachment, and delusion," indicative of the three gunas or qualities, one who does not hate illumination, attachment, and delusion when they are present, nor long for them when they disappear, who is unwavering and undisturbed through all these reactions of the material qualities, remaining neutral and transcendental, knowing that the modes alone are active, who is situated in the self and regards alike happiness and distress, who looks upon a lump of earth, a stone, and a piece of gold with an equal eye, who is equal toward the desirable and the undesirable, who is steady, situated equally well in praise and blame, honor and dishonor, who treats alike both friend and enemy, and who has renounced all material activities, such a person is said to have transcended the modes of nature. So you may have that translation in your edition. If you have the translation by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, I left that translation as is, rather than offering a different translation. Our next verse, 26. And one who renders undeviating service to me by means of devotional yoga transcends these modes of material nature and rises to the level of Brahman. And then finally, text 27. Indeed, I am the foundation of that imperishable and eternal Brahman, which is the constitutional position of ultimate happiness. So now let's go back and look at each one of these verses individually. All right, going back now to Arjuna's question. My dear Lord, what are the characteristics that define one who is transcendental to these three modes? How do they conduct themselves? And how does one transcend these three modes of nature? So, why might Arjuna want to know about this? In the previous verses, Krishna has described what it's like to be entangled and how to recognize different people under the influence of these different qualities of material nature, and has recommended that one be situated beyond the influence of these qualities of material nature and therefore be liberated to act freely rather than acting according to the dictates of these modes of being that in our conditioned state act on us and oblige us to respond to our destiny according to the programming or conditioning that is our lot on account of whatever our karma happens to be in this life, whatever reaction we are experiencing to previous actions that bring about a particular kind of body, a particular state of mind, a particular disposition, etc. So, how to recognize someone who is genuinely free? One reason is that these are the folks that you want to hang out with and learn from, because we become like who we associate with. And this is one of the really important things about yoga in general and devotional yoga in particular, which, as we'll see, is what Krishna is going to recommend once again as the answer to the third question, which is how does one transcend these three qualities of material nature? It is always easier and much more enjoyable to walk the spiritual path with a sangha, with a group. Satsang means to hang out with people who are interested in understanding the truth and hearing from people who are not just on that path, but hopefully people who are a little farther down that path than we are, because we become like who we hang out with. If we hang out with people who are free from the influence of the qualities of material nature, then we ourselves will develop that same characteristic of freedom. how do they conduct themselves? That is to say, not just how do you recognize them, but how do you emulate them? How do you follow in their footsteps? How do you become like they are? So three questions, but related questions. And now in our next verse, Krishna gives the answer to the first two. So the first one, what are the characteristics? Characteristics are, the Blessed Lord said, O son of Pandu, one who does not hate illumination, attachment, and delusion when they are present, nor long for them when they disappear. So that's the first characteristic, is that you develop a sort of indifference to the qualities of material nature. Not only do they not affect you, but you don't have any ill will toward them. You don't blame them for anything. They're not distasteful. Sometimes when we are relatively new to the path of liberation, or just starting to experience some taste of that freedom, or even if we have simply developed the desire to be free, which in and of itself is a big step, well, then we might develop an aversion to these qualities of material nature that we now realize have imprisoned us and forced us to act in particular ways. And as Patanjali tells us in his Yoga Sutras, that attachment and aversion are both obstacles to yoga. So it's natural to, at first, think in terms or feel in terms of a distaste or dislike, or even cultivate an aversion to these three qualities of material nature once you're able to see them and understand how they shape your own psychology, or how they make others act in a particular way that you find unimpressive or irritating even, or downright evil. So this is a little bit of a hurdle to get over. And one who is transcendental to the modes is someone who has gotten over that particular hurdle. Not disdainful of the modes, nor do they hanker for them, nor do they have an attachment for them. So attachment and aversion on a real meta level is the having overcome attachment and aversion on this kind of big picture level. That's the first characteristic. Then the next one is an answer to how do they conduct themselves? How do they act? One who is unwavering and undisturbed through all these reactions of the material qualities, remaining neutral and thus transcendental. In my case, it's the ability to read the New York Times or Politico and not freak out, not get angry, not get despondent, to see this, see the news, see the movements of the qualities of material nature that make the material world what it is, make people what they are. To be able to see that with a phrase that some of you have heard before, that I like to bring in to describe this particular kind of detachment as compassionate detachment. That is to say, it's constructive indifference. It's seeing things as they are while retaining compassion for people who are being adversely affected by these qualities of material nature, either because of how they are affected personally and directly, or how the actions of others are affecting them. And we'll pause here for a question. Jane asks, aren't you talking about being more of the witness or the higher self in terms of indifference? Good question. So there are, according to the Bhagavad-gita, we have 3 identities that we have to make a distinction between. The first identity is our misidentification as the mind and body as ourself. So normally, or at least conventionally, we think of this as the lower self, the misidentified self, the illusory self, the self that is actually the qualities of material nature producing the fluctuating states of mind that we identify with during the course of a day, during the course of a week, during the course of our lives. There's a higher self with a lowercase h, and that's us in our true nature. That is to say, our eternal spiritual identity. And that's the witness. In the previous chapter, we spoke, Krishna spoke about the field, namely the body, which includes the mind, the intelligence, the ego. And the knower of the field, that's the higher self with the lowercase h, the one who is conscious of the fluctuations of the mind and who is capable of stepping back to the position of witness and saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm not those fluctuations. I'm the person who is aware of the movements of the mind, of the movements and changes of the body. And so we start to make this gradual identification with this higher self rather than the illusory or lower self. And then the third higher self, the third identity, is the higher self with a capital H, whom Krishna describes as the knower of all fields, the knower within each field, or that is to say, the supreme person within the heart of all individual persons who experience the movements of the mind and body. So there's us, who can be the witness to the illusion or the illusory identification with the mind and body. And then there is the supreme person within our hearts. And even though I'm a person and you're a different person and everybody's a different person, there's one supreme person, the Param Atma, who is within everyone's heart, who knows everything about everybody. And that's not us, that's Krishna in one of the 3 different aspects of the Supreme Being. Brahman, the ground of all being, the spiritual substratum of existence itself, being itself. The omniscient and all-pervading Vishnu expansion, present everywhere, in everything, everywhere, all the time. And the personal form, Bhagavan, of the Supreme Person, who is Krishna speaking the Bhagavad-gita to Arjuna and by extension, us. So whereas Krishna is the Param Atma within all beings, we are the individual Atma, and we only know our field of activities, mind and body, as opposed to the Paramatma, who is the knower of all fields and all bodies. So this is something we don't always hear, the idea that there's not 2, a lower self and a higher self, but 3, a lower self, the illusory self, the lowercase h higher self, who is Atma, spiritual being, all of us as unique individuals, and then the higher self with a capital H, who is the one supreme being within the hearts of all beings. So, Jane, let me know if that answers your question. And if you have a follow-up question or comment, I would be very happy to hear that. You're very welcome. Okay. Then we will move on to, and if anyone else has a question, by the way, at any time, please keep those cards and letters coming in. All right, so moving on to the next portion of this cluster of verses, knowing that the modes alone are active, who is situated in the self, and regards happiness and distress as the same. So these, once again, are symptoms, that is to say, an internal state of being, as opposed to an action or how one conducts oneself, which is external. So the next portion, who looks upon a lump of earth, a stone, and a piece of gold with an equal eye, who is equal toward the desirable and the undesirable, who is steady and situated equally well in praise and blame, honor and dishonor, who treats alike both friend and enemy, and who has renounced all material activities. So these are all answers to the second question, which is how do they conduct themselves? Such a person is said to have transcended these qualities of material nature. So this is actually a repetition of previous instructions. Krishna is going over, in a slightly different way, material that he's already covered. However, when he spoke of this previously, these topics were spoken about in the 6th chapter, the 7th chapter, etc. At that point, Arjuna still had doubts, and so his questions were doubt-based questions. Now, after getting through the 10th and 11th chapters, we see that Arjuna is convinced. His doubts have been dispelled, but he's asking to go deeper now from the standpoint of faith. These are now faith-based questions because he has reason to have faith in Krishna's instructions. He already had faith in Krishna's instructions, otherwise he wouldn't have asked, but he needed Krishna to dispel his doubts. Now his doubts are dispelled and he's asking to go deeper into the subject matter. So Krishna is obliging him by going deeper into verses that he already spoke earlier. For example, in the 6th chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna that one who is spiritually situated by virtue of both acquired knowledge and realized knowledge, that is to say, by theoretical understanding and experiential understanding, who has conquered the senses, that is to say, in control of the mind and the senses rather than being controlled by the mind and senses, who sees a clump of earth, a common stone, or gold as being of equal value. Such a person is said to be fixed in yoga. So these are some of the exact same examples. Earlier, Krishna said this person is fixed in yoga. Now he's saying this person has transcended the modes of material nature. And that's kind of synonymous. To be situated in yoga is to be transcendently situated relative to the qualities of material nature. Then in the 7th chapter, he goes on to explain that earth, water, fire, air, and ether, otherwise known as solids, liquids, radiant energy, gases, and space, the mind, the intellect, and the false ego, these 8 constitute an 8-fold division of his separated material energy, meaning that the 3 qualities of material nature that make up the basic constituent parts of the material energy are then subdivided yet again into these 8 divisions. And then he continues to say that besides this inferior energy, so he qualifies the material energy as both separated and therefore inferior. Even though it's divine energy, it's still a lesser kind of energy because it's not conscious. Besides this inferior energy, O mighty armed one, know that I have another superior energy which consists of the living beings who animate the world. So in other words, consciousness is a symptom of a living being, and a conscious living being is understood to be a higher feature of reality than matter. And interestingly, the mind, the intelligence, and the ego are all considered to be in the category of matter, which is the same as we find in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So let's take a look at something that will illustrate this. I hope. So what we see here is a diagram of how the different energy centers are distributed in relationship to the physical body, and how the material elements are associated with these different energy centers or chakras, going from bottom to top. We also see how they correspond to the different sheaths, koshas, layers of body, going from bottom to top, from the most obvious or gross, the physical body, to the various progressively more metaphysical or subtle bodies, up to the point of the most subtle or finest, which is our pure spiritual form. So, taking it from the bottom, working our way up. Our bottom chakra contains all 5 of the physical elements, that is to say, earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and all of the associated sensory experiences, sound, touch, sight, taste, and smell, are also present there. And as we work our way up, what we're doing as we move the life force from the bottom chakra to the top is putting the process of material creation in reverse. We're reverse engineering the process that brought us into this situation of identifying with the material mind and body. And as we move up, as our life force moves up into the higher chakras, we gain not only distance from the material elements, separation from the material elements, but also power over the material elements. We start to control them rather than they controlling us, which is how, by the practice of yoga, one can develop mystic powers as described in the 3rd chapter of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. For our purposes here, what we actually want to look at is the right side of this chart, which shows how the different energy centers and subtle bodies are associated with these 3 qualities of material nature. The lower chakras associated with tamagun, the mode of ignorance, that is to say, when we're talking about inanimate objects, which our physical body is an inanimate object unless we are in it to animate it, as Krishna has described in one of the verses that I just referenced from previous chapters. Then the mode of passion associated with a higher group of chakras, then the mode of goodness with the highest group of chakras before we get to the highest of all the chakras, the Sahasrara chakra, which is pure spiritual consciousness or our spiritual form. And that's pure goodness, or goodness that rises above the qualities of material nature altogether. And I'm glad you like my diagram, Kamaradha. But I do accept praise, and therefore anybody else who likes this is more than welcome to tell me they like it, because I'm influenced by the modes of material nature and always therefore anxious to be praised by others. But enough of that. The main distinction here, of course, is that the higher self with the lowercase h is the self associated with the spiritual senses all the way at the top, whereas all this other stuff in the bottom is all our lower self and that which is associated with one or another level of material nature. All right. So I have a couple of other illustrations for you this evening that I hope will make this relationship that we have with the qualities of material nature even more clear, and how it gives us a little guidance in what's going on in our journey down the spiritual path. So here's what happens. Oh, let me get a question or comment first. So who is equally self-contained in pain or pleasure, in happiness or sorrow, who is content with whatever happens? Does this mean Arjuna is not experiencing happiness or sorrow? Good question. If yes, would you call that avoidance or compartmentalization? Since we are in our bodies and we do experience emotion, is it realistic to say we can ignore our feelings when they are a part of who we are, both lower self and higher self, part of our human experience? This is such a great question. So the answer here is that we don't deny our feelings. This is not an instruction to engage in spiritual bypassing where we imitate a spiritual ideal and ignore our valid feelings and experiences. One of my pet peeves with New Age modern yoga and spiritual stuff is the idea of mindfulness meditation as a coping mechanism for dealing with work, with your job. My objection is that it can paper over legitimate problems in an organization and how an organization works by foisting the responsibility to just deal with that which is unreasonable on the people who have an unreasonable situation foisted upon them, namely way too much work and not enough compensation for it, or time off, or whatever it is you need to deal with it. So one who is equal, who is contained, is someone who can both acknowledge valid feelings and respond to them appropriately, while at the same time seeing them for what they are, what they are fluctuations of the mind or sometimes the heart. They're temporary. Arjuna's whole situation is completely traumatic, and he's looking for a way to avoid it. And Krishna is telling him, sorry, bud, not going to happen. There's no way around this. You have to go through it. And here's what you need to know in order to go through it successfully, by which I mean not that he's going to win, or not that he's going to be unaffected by any of this, but that he's going to move through it in a spiritually healthy way that will be ultimately for his benefit and the benefit of everyone else involved in this situation. So by rising above these modes, you're going to experience your emotions, your valid feelings, without being controlled by them. And that puts us in the driver's seat in terms of how we respond to our destiny. So it's one thing to be overwhelmed by emotion and be controlled by that emotion. And it's another thing to experience that emotion fully and completely and still not be controlled by that emotion, so that one can move through the experience that brings those feelings on from an empowered place. And that's what this is about. And that's where Krishna is trying to take Arjuna and by extension take us. Jane, let me know if that's satisfactory. This is, of course, a very deep question with a lot of different facets to it. So that's kind of a general answer. It's not just about ignoring your feelings and moving on as if it didn't happen. It's about acknowledging and embracing them and moving through them from a position of knowledge and spiritual empowerment. I have a request in the Q&A. If I have time, can I talk more about how the senses relate to the gunas, and is there a hierarchy of senses? All right, Jess, I'm going to try to get back to that. Let's see how much time we have. Meanwhile, let me get back to my illustration that I want to share with you. Speaking of Jess's, Jessica Thomas, nice to see you here. So last week, we looked at these two diagrams, or I'm not sure what you would call this, but side by side, your three material energies, qualities of ignorance, passion, and goodness, and spiritual energies, which also have three facets, the existential potency, or the sat potency of existence itself, eternality, the cognitive potency, or chit, the potency of knowledge, and the pleasure potency, or the bliss potency, the ananda. So in our conditioned state, that is to say, before we hear about spiritual life and find ourselves attracted to spiritual life, this is our whole world. This is all we know. And we think this is us, whether we're watching the show or not. We think this is us. And then we hear something about spiritual life, and now we make a spiritual practice part of what we do. And as it becomes a greater and greater part of what we do, our spiritual life expands and our material life starts to shrink, which is to say, we develop more of an interest in our spiritual life, and we hear more about how we can make everything we do part of our spiritual life, and we gradually cultivate this kind of compassionate detachments, this distance, as it were, from the material energy. Earlier, all the way back in the second chapter, there's a verse where Krishna says that that which is night for all beings is the time of awakening for those who are self-controlled, and the time of awakening for all beings is night for the introspective sage. So this is a verse that is allegorical. Not every verse in the Bhagavad-gita is symbolic, where this one is. Here, the idea is that what is interesting and exciting for someone who's absorbed in material consciousness, people who are into spiritual life just don't have much of an attraction for that. They may have had it in the past, but now it's kind of been there, done that. This other thing is actually way more interesting. Whereas to someone who is absorbed in material life and the excitement and fun that they think they're going to be able to maintain or that they're going to pursue in material life, they're influenced by the modes of passion and ignorance, and they look at the mode of goodness and think, you know, the life of the introspective sage is boring, and they just don't see any attraction to it. So that's what this verse is talking about. But this is what happens here, is that, you know, if your interest is in the material energy, and particularly the modes of passion and ignorance, is strong, then you're not going to have a very big interest in spiritual life or what the mode of goodness. Whereas when you develop more of the mode of goodness and your consciousness is more affected by the mode of goodness, your interest in passion and ignorance starts to shrink. And that becomes a platform for moving directly into the spiritual world. Here's another way to look at it. The line on the bottom here is one lifetime. And in the material energy, we become the subject of our lives. The world revolves around us, and we are influenced by the material energy in such a way that we think that this is the kind of person I am. And therefore we have preoccupations of particular kind. My particular challenge, which is, I think other people also have this challenge. I live in Washington, D.C., and it's really easy, even though I'm not involved in the government, politics is like the thing here. And so I have a kind of a preoccupation with politics right now, and I kind of check to see, like, how are we doing here? Where are we at with things? And this is a mix of everything. I want things to go well, and I want evil to be defeated. And it's a mix of the mode of goodness, passion, and ignorance. They're all three in play there. Trying to do something that's materially good is the mode of passion, and certainly our political situation is dominated by the mode of ignorance. I think that's self-evident. Other people, their preoccupation is understandably paying the bills. They're not so interested in what goes on inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. That's not paying their bills for them. So that's the mode of passion, being attached to the outcome of one's actions. Others are like, I don't care about any of it. I just want to have fun, and I'm just going to go party. And that's kind of in the mode of ignorance. Others are preoccupied with trying to help others. Like, enough of this political stuff. I'm just going to do what I can do to help people be in a better situation. And that's in the mode of goodness. Well, once we hear about something that transcends the modes altogether, we get the idea that our one lifetime in this identification with the material energy is actually taking place in a bigger context, which is to say, the context of the spiritual energy. Brahman, the spiritual substratum of all being, is the container, in a way, for the whole experience of our life. And not just this one life, but many lifetimes that have brought us to this lifetime. That is to say, the reactions to actions in past lives create our present lives, and our actions in our current life will create future lives. This is precisely how Krishna has defined karma. As we move, as our consciousness is gradually elevated from the quality of ignorance to the quality of passion to the quality of goodness, and that becomes the launch pad into transcendental consciousness, what happens is we develop some distance from the whole experience. And as a result, we start burning up our karma so that there's no more obligation to be in a material body at all. And over time, we find ourselves checking out. So this is actually an interesting way to think about this, because right now we think in our one lifetime, everything really matters. Except in those previous lifetimes, we also thought that everything really mattered. The politics of America is what matters to me right now. If I take birth as an ant, the politics of my ant colony are going to be what matter to me. And maybe that's what I thought was important in a previous life. In another life, maybe I thought something else was the most important thing. The point here is that once we understand that there's a bigger picture, a bigger context within which the whole experience of the material energy is happening, it helps us to gain some just healthy distance from the situation in our lives and in the world that the material energy is presenting to us. And that allows us to go about the business of cultivating our spiritual consciousness and become aware of our true nature, so that for the time that we are here in the material world, we can engage with the material world and the people in the material world, in our lives, with our relationships, in a spiritually healthy way. And that ultimately is real health, as opposed to the misidentification of the self with the not self, which is an inherently unhealthy state. All right, let me know if you have some questions. And here we go. How do you explain karma in relation to terrible things that happen to people, genocide, child trafficking, etc.? I have a difficult time understanding this aspect of karma for those who aren't living the privilege of freedom, for instance. Yeah. So this is of course, a very, very big question. Why do bad things happen to good people? In previous episodes of our Gita classes, I have dealt with this question in considerable detail. And Jane, I will look for specific classes that I can recommend in the whole library of past classes. I don't want to just punt on this question. It's the one thing I'll say about it for now is that it looks, when we look at karma, it looks like a strategy for blaming the victim. And it's not that exactly. Because what we see when someone is born into a terrible situation is who they are in this life, which appears to be a perfectly innocent person. And if we came in with a blank slate, then it would seem unjust. And if we came into this life by pure chance, then it would seem totally arbitrary and make no sense at all. The Bhagavad-gita is offering us a different explanation. However unfair or unlikely or wrong it may seem, the reactions we experience in this life are due to actions in previous lives. And there's a certain hard logic to this. If one perpetrates an evil on an innocent victim, one must come back as an innocent victim in order to have a reciprocal experience by the laws of karma. If you came back as an evil person and something bad happened to you, it's not an actual apples to apples reaction. That does not mean that we should use this as an excuse for indifference to the suffering of others. The one thing a yogi, and especially a devotional yogi, cannot stand is the suffering of others. But we understand where suffering comes from. And therefore, we act on two levels. One, on the level of offering a material remedy in the form of social justice or law enforcement, or coming to the defense of someone, etc. But we also offer a spiritual solution by which karma can be stopped. So that's where I'm going to leave it for now, given the amount of time we have left for this evening and the couple of verses that I do want to cover. But your question is a totally legitimate question, and one that deserves an hour's worth of discussion all by itself. So I'm going to make a note that I'm going to follow up with you to direct you to specific classes where I spent the majority of the time speaking in more detail about this very important issue, which is very worthy of deep discussion in order to have a complete understanding. So I hope that's okay. Okay. All right, so our last two verses, 26. And one who renders undeviating service to me by means of devotional yoga transcends these modes of material nature and rises to the level of Brahman. Now, in the past, I've translated Brahman as the ground of being, spiritual substance, substratum of everything. But I left it here in the translation this time. So this is the answer to question number 3. How does one transcend the modes of material nature? And Krishna is really specific about this. He says, the Sanskrit in this is mam, unto me. Bhakti yogena, by devotional service, sevate, rendering service. So, or by linking to me through feelings of devotion expressed through service, is the meaning of bhakti yogena sevate, which is the second portion of this verse. Then one transcends the modes of material nature. So this is a really specific instruction. It's not a mechanical process of by your own effort, you raise the life force through the different chakras. It's not by study and meditation, but rather it's by cultivating feelings of devotion and expressing those feelings through active service to a person, namely Krishna, one who renders service to me. And here we are seeing the difference between Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, or the substratum of the spiritual reality beneath all existence or being itself, the individual, the localized aspect of the Supreme Being, and the personal form of the Supreme Being. So we've spoken in the past about how Brahman realization, or realization of the oneness of being, comes about through devotional service to the personal form of the Supreme Being, and how that personal form is transcendental, not a material conception. Otherwise, it wouldn't have the potency, the service to the Supreme Person wouldn't have the potency to lift one to the level of Brahman, which is to say that this is now a qualitative equality, spiritual equality with the Supreme Person, because now you're realizing that you're made of the same stuff, namely Brahman. But it's not a quantitative equality. You don't become God. You realize your spiritual unity with absolute reality and your relationship with the personal form of the complete absolute reality. that you are dealing with, you're engaging with through this devotional yoga, or devotion expressed through service. Which brings us to our last verse, which we are going to chant together, and that will finish us up for this evening. We're going to run just a few minutes over, so I hope that you can all stay for just a couple of minutes. Okay, so let me just finish up this point. We left off here where we're moving up through the qualities of material nature to transcendental consciousness, and our obligation, our karma, our obligation to take birth again and again and again is fading away until we get to the point where we are completely situated in transcendental consciousness, realizing our true spiritual nature, which is completely independent of our physical body. We are no longer obligated to take birth in the material world. But that doesn't mean that it's empty, that it's devoid of content, but rather, just as there is a multiplicity of beings and varieties of experience in the material world, the spiritual world has its own varieties of experience and engagement with others in spiritual relationships rather than material relationships. And when we go into the next chapter, then we will see how this material world is an upside down and backwards reflection of the spiritual reality. That is to say that whatever we see here in the material world, we see in its true spiritual form in spiritual consciousness. So that will be what we get into in more detail in chapter 15. Meanwhile, our last verse, I'll quickly explain some of the diacritical marks for the pronunciation cues. A dot under an N, as opposed to above, indicates you'll curl your tongue up and back so that instead of your tongue behind your teeth in a regular N sound, you're going to bring it back to the cliff behind the ridge behind your teeth. So it's more like in the center of the roof of your mouth. A dot under an S indicates an SH sound. A dot under a T also indicates that instead of the sound coming from your tongue right behind your teeth, you bring the T sound into the center of the roof of your mouth. A dot under an R, same thing. Anytime you see a dot under, then you're going to bring your tongue up into the center of the roof of your mouth to pronounce that letter. So instead of it'll be ra. A C is always a CH sound. An apostrophe over an S indicates another SH sound, but it's a deeper SH sound from further back in your mouth. So instead of sh, it's sh. You curl your tongue way back, all the way to the back of your mouth. And you pronounce each letter. So whenever you see an H after a consonant, you're just going to add some air after that consonant. And I think that takes care of everything in this verse. So once again, I will chant each line, and then if you like, you can chant the line back. Here we go. Brahmano hi pratisthaham amritasya vyasyasya cha shashvatasya cha dharmasya sukhasya ikantikasya cha. So we had a couple of those mile-long words that Sanskrit is famous for in this particular verse. So if you're watching the replay, you can always put it on pause and chant again. And we'll come back to this verse next week and slow it down and do it a couple of times so that you really get the feel for it. Meanwhile, the translation, indeed, I am the foundation of that imperishable and eternal Brahman, which is the constitutional position of ultimate happiness. So here, this is a really famous verse in the Bhagavad-gita, because Krishna is really establishing here how his personal form, his unique individual self as the person who is qualified to hold the position of the supreme being, is the source of the spiritual substratum of existence. So we have a really interesting kind of theology here in that God is both a being and being itself. But from the standpoint of spiritual hierarchy, Krishna is placing his personal form higher than the impersonal aspect of being itself. Hence, his invitation to have a relationship with him based on an exchange of love expressed through service as the means to rise from material consciousness into spiritual consciousness or to the level of Brahman. He is therefore also the foundation of constitutional position, that is to say, one's constitutional dharma or one's true essential nature. And then of ultimate happiness. So there's a relationship between our constitutional dharma or our essential nature as spiritual beings as opposed to our conditional dharma, that is to say, our essential nature that we identify with, which is actually composed of the qualities of material nature. And ultimate happiness, sukha, this translates the word sukha or sweetness. Krishna is the most beautiful being. That's part of being the supreme being. You're the most beautiful. And the beautiful form of Krishna is actually made of joy. And therefore, he is the source of joy or the foundation of joy, where joy ultimately comes from. That takes us to the end of this evening's class. So we have discussed how to recognize one who's beyond the influence of material nature, how to become one who is beyond the influence of material nature, and how Krishna is the foundation of the substratum of existence, existence itself, our true constitutional nature, and the joy of experiencing ourselves as we truly are. Okay, I'm going to come back to how the senses relate to the gunas and the hierarchy of the senses themselves when we pick things up next time. You are so welcome. I'm very glad, Kavita, that you liked the illustrations, and I was very happy to see you here. Thank you for joining us. If you have any other questions, I will take them, even though we're running a little bit late this evening. If you would like to follow up with questions, then please email me, Hari at hari-kirtana.com. I will be very, very happy to hear from you. And next week, in addition to a little bit of review of what we finished up with this evening, we're going to look at the yoga of the Supreme Person. Purushottama is the specific word. Purusha, person, Uttama, ultimate or supreme person. We begin chapter 15 with an upside down tree. We'll also discuss how to get there from here and why no electricity is needed. Annie, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time. Until then, thank you very, very much for honoring me with your presence here. It's always a great pleasure for me to spend this time with you. I hope that you've all had a good time for the last hour and 10 minutes. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. I look forward to seeing you next time and following up with you. Thank you so much for your engagement with this subject matter and your enthusiastic participation with your questions and comments. So I will look forward to following up with you all on this later. All right, ending meeting for all. Have a nice night.